Medusa, monster or misunderstood? Greek mythology tells us she could turn men to stone with a single glance. But how did a priestess in Athena's temple, as Ovid describes in his Metamorphoses, go from celebrated to cursed? Her story is not just about evil, but about power, injustice, and survival in a world ruled by gods. The myth of Medusa explores themes of victim blaming and the impact of society's perceptions on women, layers that still resonate today, especially for those who see her as a survivor. To understand how Medusa's fate became so tragic, we first need to look at who she was before the curse. In the earliest versions of her myth, Medusa's name was not synonymous with terror. Instead, she was known as a priestess who served in Athena's temple, set apart by her remarkable beauty and her devotion to the goddess. Ancient sources, especially Ovid's Metamorphoses, describe her as a young woman whose appearance was so striking that it drew the attention of mortals and gods alike. Hesiod's Theogony makes an important distinction. Medusa was the only mortal among her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, which meant she alone was vulnerable to the consequences of divine actions. This detail shaped her fate, making her both admired and exposed in a world where the gods' desires often overruled mortal will. Medusa's beauty was not just a blessing, it became a source of danger. Legends say her features rivaled those of the goddess she served, and her hair shimmered with a radiance that set her apart. In a society where appearance could determine one's destiny, Medusa's allure placed her in a precarious position. For a priestess, beauty was meant to be secondary to devotion, yet hers became impossible to ignore. The role of a priestess in Athena's temple was demanding, requiring absolute chastity and loyalty, qualities that were central to her identity and to the expectations of the society around her. Within the temple walls, Medusa's life was shaped by strict codes. A priestess's virginity was not just a personal virtue, but a sacred obligation, essential for maintaining the favor of the gods. The Temple of Athena was a place where purity was both symbol and shield, elevating its servants to a respected yet fragile position. Medusa's dedication set her apart from ordinary women, but it also made her subject to scrutiny and ultimately to the unpredictable will of the gods. The story takes a decisive turn when Poseidon, god of the sea, enters Medusa's life. According to Ovid's account, Poseidon was captivated by her beauty, and after she rejected his advances, forced himself upon her within Athena's temple. This act was not just a violation of Medusa as an individual, but a desecration of a sacred space. The power imbalance could not have been more stark. A mortal woman, upholding her vows, confronted by a god who faced no consequences for ignoring her will. The myth lays bare the vulnerability of mortals, especially women, when confronted with divine power. In the aftermath, the focus of blame shifted almost entirely onto Medusa. The moral framework of ancient Greece placed immense value on female chastity, especially for those who served the gods. A priestess's purity was seen as a reflection of the temple's sanctity, and by extension, the honor of the goddess herself. When that purity was taken from Medusa, the stain was considered hers to bear, regardless of her lack of agency. This dynamic reflects a broader pattern in Greek myths, where mortals often paid the price for the transgressions of gods. Medusa's mortal nature further intensified her predicament. While her sisters were immortal and thus untouched by the whims of fate, Medusa was entirely human. She had no divine powers, no protection, and no recourse. Her status as the only mortal Gorgon, as Hesiod notes, made her story unique and her suffering more acute. In many myths, mortals who come into contact with the gods are changed forever, but rarely is the outcome as tragic or as unjust as Medusa's. The violation in Athena's temple was not just a personal tragedy, it was a public scandal. In the eyes of the ancient Greeks, the desecration of a sacred space demanded a response. Ovid's Metamorphoses makes it clear that Athena's anger was directed not at Poseidon, but at Medusa, whose presence in the temple was now seen as a source of shame. The narrative does not dwell on the god's culpability. Instead, it shifts to the consequences for the mortal woman. This victim-blaming perspective is a recurring theme in both myth and history, and it shapes how Medusa's transformation is remembered. Athena's reaction is especially significant. Earlier sources do not emphasize jealousy as her motivation. Rather, Ovid presents Athena as outraged by the desecration of her temple. The punishment she chooses is severe and transformative. Medusa is stripped not only of her role as priestess, but of her very humanity. Her hair, once a symbol of beauty, is replaced with serpents. Her gaze, once captivating, becomes deadly. This transformation is not simply a curse. It is a complete erasure of her former self, imposed to restore the sanctity of the temple and to serve as a warning. The injustice of Medusa's fate is heightened by the fact that she had no control over what happened to her. The gods' actions were beyond question, and mortals had little choice but to endure the consequences. The myth reflects the social realities of ancient Greece, where women's lives were often defined by the expectations and judgments of others. Medusa's story stands as an example of how beauty, devotion, and vulnerability could become liabilities in a world governed by power and reputation. Yet, there is more to Medusa's story than victimhood. Even before her transformation, she embodied the tension between mortal fragility and the overwhelming force of the divine. Her downfall was not the result of personal failure, but of circumstances beyond her control. Circumstances that exposed the limitations of justice in both myth and society. The events in Athena's temple mark the turning point, setting Medusa on a path that would redefine her legacy. This sets the stage for a punishment that would rewrite Medusa's fate and challenge the myth of divine justice. Athena's response to Medusa's tragedy stands out as one of the most debated moments in Greek mythology. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, the goddess does not direct her anger at Poseidon, the perpetrator, but instead punishes Medusa, her own priestess. Ovid's account is striking for its clarity. After Medusa is violated in Athena's temple, Athena curses her by turning her beautiful hair into venomous snakes. The transformation is both immediate and severe, forever changing Medusa's fate and marking her as a figure to be feared. The injustice in this moment is unmistakable. Medusa's role as a priestess was defined by her devotion and chastity, yet when that sanctity was violated, she became the one to bear the consequences. The temple, meant to be a place of protection, becomes the site where Medusa's life is upended. Ovid emphasizes the cruelty of the act by making Athena's punishment a direct response to Medusa's wicked deed, even though Medusa was the victim. This reversal of blame is a central theme in Ovid's version, and it highlights how the myth reflects broader patterns of victim blaming that have persisted throughout history. Earlier Greek sources do not present this story in the same way. In Hesiod and other poets, Poseidon's involvement is omitted or left ambiguous, and Athena's curse, if mentioned at all, is given different motives. Ovid's retelling, written in a Roman context, is unique in its explicit condemnation of Medusa for an act she did not choose. This narrative choice casts Athena in a harsher light than most Greek poets ever did, suggesting a critical perspective on the gods themselves. The cultural context of Ovid's Rome, with its emphasis on public honor and reputation, shapes the way Athena's actions are portrayed. Rather than seeking justice or offering support, Athena's curse serves to restore her own authority after the desecration of her temple. The act is less about the pursuit of fairness and more about reasserting divine order. In this way, the myth becomes a reflection of the values and anxieties of its time, where the honor of the gods, and by extension their temples, was paramount, even if it meant sacrificing the well-being of mortals. Ovid's version also underscores the importance placed on female purity in both Greek and Roman societies. Medusa's chastity, once her highest virtue, becomes the measure by which she is judged and ultimately condemned. The brief mention of her lost purity is enough to justify her punishment in the eyes of the gods. Ovid's narrative does not linger on the morality of this judgment. Instead, it simply presents the outcome, leaving the injustice for readers to recognize. Athena's curse is described in vivid detail. Medusa's flowing hair, once admired by all, is replaced by writhing snakes. Her gaze, which once captivated those around her, now turns onlookers to stone. With this transformation, Medusa is no longer seen as a victim or a priestess, but as a monster. Yet little did Athena know, this curse would become the source of Medusa's unexpected might. The transformation strips Medusa of her humanity and her place in society. She is exiled from the world she once knew, forced into isolation by the fear she now inspires. The curse is total. Medusa is cut off from both mortal and divine acceptance, her identity reduced to a warning, a living embodiment of the consequences of defiling what the gods hold sacred. The myth offers no comfort, no path to redemption. Instead, Medusa's new form is meant to serve as a deterrent, a symbol of divine retribution. Yet, as the story unfolds, the consequences of Athena's curse become more complicated. Medusa's monstrous form, intended to isolate and punish her, also grants her a kind of power she never possessed as a mortal woman. Her gaze, now deadly, protects her from further harm. No longer vulnerable to the whims of gods or men, Medusa becomes a figure whom even heroes approach with caution. This paradox, punishment resulting in power, lies at the heart of her myth. The cultural significance of Medusa's transformation extends beyond her own story. In ancient Greece, the image of the Gorgon became a powerful symbol, used to ward off evil and protect sacred spaces. Medusa's head, with its snakes and petrifying gaze, was carved onto temples, shields, and armor. The same features that made her a monster in myth were adopted as emblems of protection and strength. This duality, fear and reverence, reflects the anxiety ancient societies felt about unchecked power, especially when embodied by women. Ovid's depiction of Athena's actions also invites us to question the role of the gods in enforcing justice. By punishing Medusa instead of Poseidon, Athena upholds a system in which divine honor outweighs individual suffering. The myth reveals the limitations of justice in a world where power determines right and wrong. Medusa's fate is not just a personal tragedy. It is a commentary on the broader structures that allowed such tragedies to occur. This theme of victim blaming is especially relevant today. Modern readers often see in Medusa's story a reflection of contemporary issues, where survivors of violence are questioned, doubted, or punished for their own suffering. Ovid's account, written centuries ago, resonates with these ongoing conversations about accountability, and the ways societies respond to injustice. The myth's endurance speaks to its ability to capture the complexities of power, blame, and survival. Despite the cruelty of her punishment, Medusa's legacy is not one of defeat. After Perseus beheads her, a story to be explored further, her severed head retains its power. Athena herself places it on her shield, the Aegis, using Medusa's image as a weapon to protect and intimidate. The irony is clear. The goddess who cursed Medusa now relies on her power for defense. Medusa, once condemned as a monster, becomes indispensable to the very gods who cast her out. This transformation from victim to symbol is central to Medusa's enduring appeal. Her story is not only about suffering, but also about the ways in which power can be reclaimed, even in the aftermath of injustice. The image of Medusa, both feared and revered, continues to provoke questions about the nature of justice and the legacy of those who are wronged. As Medusa's myth evolved, her monstrous form became more than just a cautionary tale. It emerged as a complex emblem, one that embodied both the dangers of defiance and the potential for protection. The same features that inspired terror in ancient audiences would, in time, come to represent resilience and strength. This paradox invites us to look closer at how Medusa's image was used and understood in ancient Greece. Her story did not end with her transformation. It expanded, taking on new meanings in art, architecture, and legend. The figure once meant to inspire fear became a shield, both literally and symbolically, challenging simple ideas of victimhood and power. Medusa's story did not end with her transformation or her defeat. Instead, her image became one of the most recognizable symbols in ancient Greek culture. The dual legacy of Medusa, both as a monster capable of unimaginable destruction and as a powerful protective force, shaped how the Greeks understood her place in their world. This tension between terror and protection is especially clear in the way her likeness was used throughout temples, armor, and everyday objects. After her transformation, Medusa's monstrous form was depicted with striking detail in early Greek art. Artists emphasized her otherness: wide, staring eyes, a protruding tongue, tusks jutting from her mouth, and a head crowned with writhing snakes. The Gorgon pediment from the Temple of Artemis on Corfu, dating to around 580 BCE, stands as one of the clearest examples. Here, Medusa is shown with muscular limbs, wings, and a belt made of double snakes, flanked by leopards as guardians. Her presence dominates the temple's entrance, overlooking the port and signaling the city's power and wealth to all who approached. The intent was clear. The terrifying features that made her a monster were also what made her an ideal protector. The Greeks used apotropaic magic, believing Medusa's gaze could repel evil by turning threats to stone. This belief shaped the placement of her image in key locations. Medusa's face was carved above temple doors, painted on shields, and molded onto amulets. The Gorgoneion, as her head was called, became a common motif. It was not only meant to frighten away enemies, but also to guard against ill fortune and evil spirits. The very word Medusa comes from the ancient Greek for guardian, underscoring her role as a vigilant force rather than simply a creature to be feared. Medusa's impartial power, the ability to petrify any who met her gaze, regardless of intent, made her the perfect symbol of protection. Unlike other mythological guardians who might be swayed by favor or bribes, Medusa's power was absolute and indiscriminate. To place her image at the entrance of a temple, as in Corfu, was to declare that no threat would go unanswered. In this way, The Greeks transformed the chaos and danger Medusa represented into a tool of order and safety. From temple guardian to battlefield weapon, Medusa's head passed into Perseus's hands and then onto Athena's shield. Perseus, after slaying Medusa, used her severed head as a weapon. He carried it in a kibisis, or special pouch, and called upon its petrifying gaze to defeat adversaries. One of the most famous stories tells how Perseus turned the sea monster Cetus to stone, saving Andromeda from sacrifice. The head's power was so absolute that even Atlas, the Titan, was transformed into a mountain upon seeing it. These tales reinforce the idea that Medusa's power, though monstrous, could be harnessed for heroic purposes. When Perseus gave the head to Athena, the myth took another turn. Athena affixed the Gorgonean to her shield, the aegis as described by poets like Hesiod and dramatists such as Aeschylus. The image of Medusa on the shield was more than a decoration. It was a declaration of divine might. Warriors who faced Athena in battle confronted not only the goddess herself, but the petrifying terror of Medusa. The shield's protective function extended the apotropaic power of Medusa's image, making it an emblem of both destruction and defense. The use of the Gorgoneon spread beyond temples and shields. It appeared as a decorative motif on roof tiles, breastplates, and pottery. Roof tiles adorned with Medusa's face protected homes and sanctuaries, while soldiers wore her image into battle to intimidate foes and ward off harm. The Gorgonean's widespread use shows how deeply the Greeks valued the dual nature of Medusa's power. It was not enough to fear her. Her image was needed to keep danger at bay. This duality, however, also reflected deeper anxieties within Greek society. Medusa's monstrous form, with her wild hair of snakes and fierce gaze, embodied a type of power that was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. In a culture that prized order and rationality, Medusa stood for the unpredictable forces that threatened stability. Her transformation from a mortal woman into a Gorgonon was often read as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, especially female power. The myth warned of what could happen if boundaries were crossed, yet it also revealed a fascination with the very forces it sought to control. Over time, the depiction of Medusa began to change. By the 5th century BCE, artists started to soften her features. The bulging eyes and tusks gave way to a more human, and sometimes even beautiful, face. This shift reflected broader trends in Greek art, which began to explore more nuanced representations of mythological figures. Medusa was no longer simply a monster. Traces of her former humanity began to emerge in her image. The Gorgonean became less about inspiring terror and more about conveying a tragic complexity. This evolution in Medusa's portrayal paralleled changing attitudes toward myth and power. As Greek society developed, so too did its understanding of the stories it told. Medusa's image, whether monstrous or beautiful, terrifying or protective, remained a powerful reminder of the thin line between fear and reverence. She was a figure shaped by both punishment and resilience, embodying the contradictions at the heart of Greek mythology. The enduring presence of Medusa in Greek art and architecture speaks to the lasting impact of her story. She was a protector of temples, a weapon for heroes, and a symbol on the shield of a goddess. Each role reinforced her importance, not just as a monster, but as a guardian whose power could be used for good or ill. The Greeks recognized this complexity, and their use of Medusa's image reflected a culture that understood the need to harness both order and chaos. As centuries passed, Medusa's legacy continued to evolve. Her story, once confined to temples and battlefields, began to inspire new interpretations. Artists and thinkers would later revisit her myth, drawn to the emotional depth and moral ambiguity at its core. The question of whether Medusa was a monster, a victim, or a protector would resurface in different eras, each finding new meaning in her image. This ongoing fascination set the stage for a dramatic shift in how Medusa was understood. As we move forward, notice how later generations reimagined her story, transforming her from a symbol of terror to a figure of tragedy, and exploring the complexities that made her myth endure. During the Renaissance, Medusa's myth became a subject of renewed artistic and intellectual interest. Artists and thinkers of this era, drawn by the complexity of her story, began to shift focus from her monstrous reputation to the profound tragedy and emotion embedded in her fate. This period, defined by a humanist outlook, encouraged the exploration of mythological figures as reflections of the human experience. Medusa's narrative, marked by injustice and transformation, offered fertile ground for such reinterpretation. Rather than portraying her simply as an object of fear or a symbol of supernatural protection, Renaissance artists depicted Medusa's severed head to examine the raw emotion and suffering beneath her legend. The Renaissance worldview placed a new emphasis on individual emotion and psychological depth. In Medusa's story, artists found a way to explore themes of beauty, mortality, and the exercise of power. The enduring image of her decapitated head, so prominent in earlier art as a warning or talisman, was now reimagined to express the vulnerability and sorrow of her character. It was no longer just a monstrous emblem. It became a canvas for examining the fragile balance between allure and destruction, humanity and monstrosity. Caravaggio's Medusa, c. 1597, stands as a striking example of this evolution. In this painting, Caravaggio captures Medusa in the immediate aftermath of her death, her face frozen in post-decapitation agony. The viewer is confronted with her wide-eyed terror and pain, the snakes in her hair writhing in confusion, and blood streaming from her severed neck. Unlike earlier depictions that emphasized her monstrous features, Caravaggio's Medusa is marked by a deeply human expression. The agony and shock in her eyes suggest not only the pain of death, but also the injustice of her fate. The painting's visceral impact lies in its refusal to reduce Medusa to a simple monster. Instead, it compels viewers to recognize her suffering and the tragedy of her transformation. This focus on emotional intensity aligns with the Renaissance interest in exploring the psychological realities behind myth. Caravaggio's Medusa is not just a symbol of terror, but a figure who evokes empathy and reflection. Her beauty, once a source of admiration and envy, is now inseparable from the horror of her demise. The painting embodies the duality that fascinated Renaissance artists, the coexistence of allure and danger, vulnerability and threat. By presenting Medusa's humanity so starkly, Caravaggio invites the audience to question the justice of her punishment and to see the myth through a more compassionate lens. In contrast, Benvenuto Cellini's bronze sculpture, Perseus with the Head of Medusa, 1554, offers a different Renaissance perspective. Here, the focus shifts to Perseus, who stands triumphant, holding Medusa's severed head aloft. The sculpture, with its careful attention to the hero's athletic form and composed stance, reflects the Renaissance celebration of human achievement and the heroic ideal. Perseus embodies the mastery of fate and the triumph of reason over chaos. Medusa's head, though reduced to a trophy in his grasp, still retains a powerful presence. Her features, while less grotesque than in earlier portrayals, hint at the enduring force of her myth. The snakes in her hair remain animated, and the lifeless stare of her eyes continues to suggest a power that persists beyond death. Cellini's work highlights the tension between heroism and tragedy that characterizes Renaissance interpretations of Medusa. While the sculpture celebrates Perseus's victory, it cannot fully erase the unsettling power of Medusa's image. Her head, held high as a symbol of conquest, still commands attention and respect. The contrast between Perseus's idealized form and the grim reality of Medusa's fate underscores the complexities of power at play in the myth. The heroic narrative is foregrounded, but Medusa's enduring menace lingers in the background, reminding viewers that even in defeat, she remains formidable. By examining both Caravaggio's painting and Cellini's sculpture, we see how Renaissance artists used Medusa's story to explore the interplay between beauty and destruction, suffering and triumph. Caravaggio's Medusa draws us into the emotional core of her tragedy, while Cellini's Perseus elevates the hero's achievement, but cannot fully dispel the specter of Medusa's power. These works reflect the Renaissance fascination with duality, reason and chaos, heroism and victimhood, mortality and the pursuit of glory. Renaissance culture's preoccupation with mortality, memento mori, found a vivid symbol in Medusa's severed head. Her beauty, which once set her apart and made her vulnerable to the gods' whims, became the very thing that sealed her doom. The image of her head, suspended between life and death, served as a reminder of the fragility of existence and the inevitability of fate. In art, Medusa's story became a meditation on the limits of human achievement and the costs of power, both for those who wield it and those who suffer under it. This period also marked a shift in how Medusa's narrative was understood in relation to broader cultural themes. Myths were increasingly seen as vehicles for exploring human flaws, societal pressures, and the consequences of unchecked authority. Medusa's punishment and transformation became a lens through which to examine the destructive potential of power, whether divine or mortal. While Perseus stood as the embodiment of Renaissance ideals, Medusa's story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of injustice and the blurred boundaries between hero and monster. The Renaissance reinterpretation of Medusa did not simply add emotional depth to her myth. It also complicated traditional ideas about beauty and morality. By highlighting her suffering and humanity, artists encouraged viewers to reconsider the nature of monstrosity and the true meaning of heroism. Medusa's fate, once a straightforward tale of divine punishment, now raised questions about the cost of victory and the consequences of condemning those who are powerless to defend themselves. These portrayals set the stage for viewing Medusa not just as terror, but as a tragic, complex figure. The groundwork laid by Renaissance artists and thinkers made it possible for later generations to see Medusa in new ways, beyond the boundaries of fear or pity. As the centuries passed, her story would continue to evolve, inviting new interpretations and resonating with changing ideas about power, justice, and identity. In recent decades, Medusa's image has been redefined by feminist thinkers, artists, and activists who see in her story a powerful symbol of feminine rage, resilience, and resistance. This modern reclamation does not focus on the monstrous or tragic alone, but instead highlights Medusa as an emblem of defiance against injustice and patriarchal control. Mary Valentis and Anne Devane, in their book Female Rage, note that even when women forget the details of Medusa's myth, they still identify with her as an image of rage, her face and story lingering in the collective imagination as a vessel for emotions often suppressed or demonized in women. The transformation of Medusa's meaning began in earnest during the rise of feminist movements in the 20th century. As conversations about power, autonomy, and gendered violence gained momentum, Medusa's story was re-examined through a new lens. Instead of a monster punished for her beauty or a vanquished obstacle to a male hero, she became a victim of injustice who survives and resists. Feminist writers and artists saw in Medusa's rage not a threat, but a source of strength, an anger that could be owned and directed toward challenging oppressive systems. The Feminist Journal. Women, a journal of liberation, chose Medusa for its cover, suggesting that her image could serve as a guide for women learning to channel their anger into power. Scholar Emily Irwin Culpepper observed that the Gorgon was rapidly adopted by feminists as a symbol of female rage that could be claimed, rather than feared or hidden. Medusa's petrifying gaze, once read as a curse, was reframed as a tool of resistance, a direct challenge to the structures that sought to control or silence women. This reimagining of Medusa reached a new level of visibility with the advent of the #MeToo movement. As survivors of sexual harassment and assault spoke out, Medusa's story of victim blaming and punishment resonated deeply. The hashtag #MeDusa too appeared on social media, connecting her myth to the real experiences of women confronting abuse and demanding accountability. In this context, Medusa's origin as a victim of Poseidon's assault, punished not for wrongdoing, but for surviving, became a powerful metaphor for the ways society often protects perpetrators while punishing those who come forward. Contemporary art has played a key role in this reclamation. Judy Takach's portrait, Medusa 2, 2018, stands out as a pivotal example. In this work, Takach restores Medusa's beauty and overlays a #stigmata on her forehead, directly referencing the victim-blaming narrative that has followed Medusa through history. The portrait presents Medusa not as a monster, but as a survivor whose story demands attention and empathy. Takach's painting invites viewers to reconsider the myth, highlighting the injustice of Medusa's punishment and the strength required to endure and resist. Another influential reinterpretation comes from Hélène Cixous, whose essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, became foundational for feminist literary theory. Cixous argues that Medusa's monstrous reputation was born from patriarchal fear of female desire and agency. She writes, "You only have to look at Medusa straight on to see her, and she's not deadly, she's beautiful and laughing." With this line, Cixous encourages women to reclaim Medusa as a symbol of beauty, laughter, and strength, rather than as an object of fear. Her essay calls for women to write their own stories and to embrace the power that has long been denied or demonized. Medusa's image has also become a symbol of solidarity and protection within feminist and queer communities. Alana Dyke Woman's 1976 collection, They Will Know Me by My Teeth, features a Gorgon drawing on its cover, positioning Medusa as a guardian of female power and secrets. For many, Medusa's face offers a sense of shared experience and mutual defense, a reminder that anger and defiance can be a source of connection, not just isolation. Luciano Garbatti's sculpture. Medusa with the Head of Perseus, 2008, provides a striking visual reversal of the traditional myth. Here, Medusa stands upright and composed, holding the severed head of Perseus. This inversion challenges the long-standing narrative of male heroism and female monstrosity. The sculpture's accompanying text, "Be thankful we only want equality and not payback," underscores its message. Medusa is not seeking vengeance, but justice and recognition. By placing the power in Medusa's hands, Garbati invites viewers to question who truly holds agency in the myth and to reconsider the meaning of heroism and villainy. Writers like Elizabeth Johnston have further explored Medusa's relevance in contemporary politics. In her essay for The Atlantic, Johnston calls Medusa the original nasty woman, drawing a parallel between the demonization of outspoken women in myth and the treatment of women in modern public life. Johnston points out that strong, independent women have often been cast as threats requiring suppression, and that Medusa's story is, at its core, a narrative of rape and victim blaming. This reading resonates with current debates about who gets to define justice and whose voices are heard. Stephen Wilk, in his book, Medusa, Solving the Mystery of the Gorgon, argues that Medusa's enduring appeal among feminists comes from her role as a protector and symbol of rage. Her power lies not just in her ability to petrify, but in her capacity to resist being silenced or controlled. Medusa's transformation from a figure of terror to one of empowerment reflects a broader cultural shift toward recognizing the value of anger and resistance, especially in the face of injustice. The modern reclamation of Medusa also critiques traditional ideas about male heroism. Perseus's slaying of Medusa, once celebrated as a triumph, is now seen by some as an act of domination over a woman whose power threatened established norms. This reinterpretation does not erase the violence of the original myth, but asks whether the story's real lesson is about the dangers of unchecked authority and the cost of silencing those who refuse to conform. Medusa's story endures because it continues to speak to the complexities of power, identity, and justice. Her myth is layered with meanings that shift as society changes, offering a mirror for contemporary struggles over who gets to define heroism, who is cast as a monster, and who is allowed to speak. The figure of Medusa, once a warning against female defiance, now stands as a challenge to anyone who would use fear or shame to suppress another's voice. Through works like Takache's portrait and Garbati's sculpture, Medusa's image is no longer confined to the role of victim or monster. Instead, she is reclaimed as an emblem of empowerment, her story reinterpreted to reflect the resilience, rage, and agency that define her legacy today. These modern reinterpretations do more than update an old myth. They flip its meaning, transforming Medusa from a figure of punishment into a lasting symbol of strength. This ongoing transformation of Medusa's story invites us to consider how myths reveal and challenge the values of their societies. Looking back at Medusa's journey, from priestess to gorgon, from victim to a symbol of power, we see how her myth has shaped and reflected conversations about power, injustice, and survival. Her transformation invites us to reconsider who holds authority in stories and how narratives about consent, blame, and resilience endure across generations. Her legacy, especially as reclaimed in movements like #MeToo, shows that ancient myths can still provoke and inspire reflection today. Tell us which overlooked myth you think deserves a second look in the comments. If you found this deep dive illuminating, subscribe for more myth deconstructions. Medusa's story reminds us to keep questioning the stories we inherit.